Your pantry isn't actually a pantry at all. Not anymore. Not the way your great-grandparents understood it. What you call a pantry today is just a room where you store things you bought from somewhere else. A temporary holding tank for products manufactured months ago, shipped across continents, and wrapped in plastic designed to fail the moment you bring them home. Your grandparents would not recognize it as a pantry. To them, a pantry was a skill. It was a place you built. It was a system you maintained every single week of your life, and it determined whether your family ate through the winter or whether you didn't. I learned this the first time I watched my mother plan a meal in December, in the middle of snow, and pull ingredients from storage that she had prepared with her own hands in August. Not bought, not ordered, prepared. She knew exactly what was in that root cellar because she had put it there herself. She knew how long it would last because she had learned, like her mother before her, to calculate time in jars and preservation methods instead of expiration dates printed by strangers. Most of you have never made anything you eat. You have never looked at a living plant and decided what parts to preserve and for how long. You have never stood in your own kitchen and realized that the meal you are about to eat came entirely from work you did 3 months earlier. That changes everything about how you think about survival. It changes how you think about independence, and it changes whether you panic or stay calm when the supply chain breaks, even for just a week. But here is the secret nobody tells you. This kind of pantry, a real one, does not start at the grocery store. It does not start with buying freeze-dried meals or canning kits from a homesteading website. It starts with understanding what your ancestors stored, and more importantly, why certain foods last without electricity, and others do not. The Amish community has kept this knowledge alive, not because they are traditional, although they are, but because every single day they have to answer a question that most of us never ask. If today is the last day the store delivers, what do I eat tomorrow? That question changes everything. Before we talk about what goes into a real pantry, we need to understand when it gets filled. Most people think preservation happens in September, or October, or whenever they decide to can something. Wrong. Preservation starts in March. It starts when you plant seeds. It starts when you decide not which vegetables look pretty at the farmer's market, but which ones your family will actually eat, and which ones store well without becoming inedible mush. The Amish do not grow tomatoes because they taste good in August, although they do. They grow tomatoes because they know, with certainty, that a properly cured tomato will feed them in February. They plant squash not for September dinner, but for March breakfast. They grow beans, knowing that the dried version will still be there in June, still be nutritious, still be edible, requiring only water and heat to become a meal. This is not sentiment. This is mathematics. This is survival turned into agriculture. Let me be direct about what a real pantry actually is, because the confusion around this is why most people fail before they even start. A pantry is not a closet. It is not a room where you stockpile things. A pantry is a system with 5 components, and if you are missing even one of them, the whole thing collapses. First, you need to know what grows. Second, you need to know when it is ready. Third, you need to know how to preserve it correctly for your specific climate and storage conditions. Fourth, you need to understand the shelf life of each item, not the date printed on a package, but the actual, real shelf life that your ancestors knew through generations of trial and error. And fifth, you need to rotate and use what you stored, which means you have to build a rhythm into your life that connects seasons. Most modern people have none of this. They have a closet with random things in it that they bought at different times, and they have no idea which things are still good and which ones are poison. Here is what gets lost in translation. When your ancestors preserved food, they did not just preserve food, they preserved time. Every jar of preserved tomatoes was an investment in future meals. Every string of dried herbs was a bet against winter. Every crock of fermented cabbage was a calculation about whether the family would have vegetables in February or whether they would not. This was not quaint. This was not rustic. This was engineering. It was chemistry. It was discipline, and it required understanding the natural world in a way that modern education has completely removed from our consciousness. You can buy a book on canning, and you can follow the steps, and you can put food in jars, and sometimes you will poison yourself and not know it until people get sick. You can follow the recipe exactly and still fail because you did not understand the principles underneath the steps. Your great-grandmother did not need a recipe because she understood the principle. Acid plus time plus cold equals preservation. She could adjust for altitude. She could adjust for the humidity in her cellar. She could taste fermented cabbage and know, instantly, whether it would last until spring or whether it would spoil in January. This is where most people get stuck. They think preservation is about following rules. They think it is about buying the right equipment and being careful. But the Amish approach to preservation is not about rules. It is about understanding what you are doing and why. When an Amish grandmother preserves food, she is not following a recipe from the internet. She is applying knowledge that has been tested across generations. She knows that fermentation requires salt, a ratio, and time. And she can calculate that ratio based on the weight of the vegetable, not a set of instructions. She knows that curing meat requires salt, and sometimes smoke, and a temperature that stays within a narrow window. And she knows how to maintain that window using only her knowledge of her own cellar and her own climate. She knows that drying requires air movement and specific humidity levels, and she can build a drying rack and position it so that it works perfectly for her elevation, her season, and the specific crop she is preserving. This is not magic. This is literacy. It is reading the natural world instead of reading a label. When you realize what a real pantry is, you start to understand why the modern pantry fails so completely during any kind of disruption. A modern pantry is dependent on the supply chain continuing forever without interruption. It is dependent on trucks arriving on schedule. It is dependent on electricity keeping your refrigerator running and your freezer frozen. It is dependent on manufacturers in other countries continuing to produce the things you have decided you like to eat. It is dependent on trucking companies continuing to function. It is dependent on gas stations having fuel. It is dependent on your money continuing to have value. It is dependent on the system continuing to work. And if any link in that chain breaks, your pantry empties faster than you can refill it. But a real pantry, a pantry built the way your ancestors built them, is dependent on nothing except your skill and your willingness to put in the work. The reason the Amish have kept this alive is not because they are stuck in the past or because they rejected modernity out of stubbornness. They kept it alive because they understood something that most of us are only now beginning to remember. Independence is not a product you can buy. Independence is a skill you practice every single day. It is knowing that you can feed your family without waiting for a delivery truck. It is knowing that you can preserve what you grow at the peak of its nutrition, when it is at its best, instead of buying things that were picked 3 days ago or 3 weeks ago and shipped across the country getting worse the whole time. This is the pantry that actually matters. This is the system that works. And this is what I want to teach you about, starting with the specific techniques that your ancestors used to make things last. And then we will move into how you build this into your own life, starting right now. Even if you have a small apartment, even if you have no garden, even if you are starting completely from zero knowledge. The first thing you need to understand is why certain foods last and others do not. This is not complicated, but it is fundamental. A food lasts as long as it does because you have removed or controlled one of the things that makes it spoil. Spoilage happens through 3 main mechanisms: bacteria, mold, and oxidation. Your ancestors had no concept of bacteria or mold or oxidation as invisible organisms or chemical processes. They did not have science class, but they had observation, and they had hundreds of years of trial and error, and through that, they figured out that if you removed the moisture from something, it would not spoil. If you added salt to something, it would not spoil. If you sealed it away from air, it would not spoil. If you heated it to certain temperatures, it would not spoil. If you fermented it and created an acid environment, it would not spoil. These were not opinions. These were facts learned through repetition and passed down through generations. But here is what separates the Amish understanding from the internet homesteading blog understanding. The Amish do not just know that these methods work. They understand the limits. They know that drying works until a certain humidity level is reached, and then it stops working. They know that salt works until the ratio is wrong, and then it stops working. They know that fermentation works until the temperature is wrong, and then mold can grow on top instead of beneficial bacteria growing inside. This knowledge comes from failing. It comes from experience. It comes from having to eat from the same pantry, week after week, year after year, and noticing when something starts to smell wrong or taste wrong or look wrong. You develop a sense. You develop intuition. You develop competence. Most people think that learning preservation is about learning recipes. You will see lists online. 50 canning recipes you can make this weekend. or 10 best foods to preserve. This is missing the point so completely that it actually makes things harder. The recipes are the least important part. The principle is what matters. If you understand why fermentation works, you can ferment anything that has sugars and is submerged in salt water. If you understand why salt preservation works, you can salt any vegetable. If you understand why smoking works, you can smoke any meat. The recipe is just an application of the principle. Most people try to learn the recipe without understanding the principle. And then when something goes slightly different, when the weather is different, when the vegetable is a different size, when the season is different, they panic because they have no framework for understanding what to do. This is exactly where the Amish system excels, because they are not following recipes from a published source. They are applying principles that they have internalized through years of practice. They can look at a batch of pickles and know, instantly, whether it was made correctly or not. They can taste fermented cabbage and know whether it will last until spring. They can inspect preserved meat and know whether it was smoked long enough or whether it needs more time. This is competence that only comes from doing it over and over, learning from mistakes, and building a body of knowledge that is stored not in a cookbook, but in your hands and your senses. Now, the second critical thing that separates a real pantry from a fake one is rotation. This is where most people completely fail, and they do not even realize it. They build a pantry, they put things in it, and then they never touch it. They do not eat from it, they do not use it. They save it for an emergency. But this is exactly backwards. A real pantry is something you eat from constantly. It is something you use every single day. The reason for this is practical. You need to know whether things are actually still good. You need to know whether your preservation methods are working. You need to discover problems before they become disasters. If you store something for 5 years and then open it and it is moldy, that is too late to learn anything useful. But if you store something for 5 months and then open it and use it and it is perfect, then you have learned that your method works for 5 months. If you try it again and add a slightly different variable, you learn whether that variable matters. This is how knowledge builds. This is how competence develops. The Amish rotate through their pantry as part of their weekly rhythm. Monday is wash day. Tuesday is ironing day. Wednesday is market day or visiting day. But every single day involves at least one meal that comes partially or entirely from the pantry. They are not saving it for an emergency. They are using it as part of normal life. This means that by the time winter arrives, they have already used and replaced some of what they stored. It means that the oldest things get eaten first and the newest things move to the front. It means that you discover problems early, when you can still do something about them. It also means that you are constantly practicing the skill of using preserved foods, so you know exactly how to work with them and how to make them taste good. This is something that cannot be learned from a website. This is something that can only be learned through repetition. When you make soup from your preserved beans every week, you learn how much salt you need because the beans were preserved in salt. You learn how long they take to cook. You learn how they change the flavor of the broth. You learn whether one jar is enough for your family or whether you need 2. You learn all of this through doing it, not through reading about it. And then, when the supply chain breaks, or when you are snowed in, or when you simply decide that you want to eat food that you made instead of food that came from a factory, you already know exactly how to do it. You have already practiced it 100 times. But preservation is only half the skill. The other half is knowing what to do with what you have preserved. My grandmother used to say that a pantry full of preserved food is just history if you do not know how to cook it. She meant something very specific. She meant that modern cooking, the cooking most people learn now, depends on fresh ingredients arriving at your house every few days. It depends on the assumption that you can buy garlic today and use it fresh. It depends on recipes that were written for supermarket conditions, not for storage conditions. When you cook from storage, everything is different. Your garlic is dried, not fresh. Your tomatoes are dried or canned, not fresh. Your herbs are dried. Your meat, if you have preserved any, is smoked or salted. Your milk, if you have any at all, is dried powder or it has turned into cheese. The flavors are concentrated. The textures are different. The cooking times are longer. If you approach it like you are cooking from a modern supermarket, you will fail. Your dishes will taste wrong. Your textures will be off. You will conclude that storage foods do not taste good, and then you will stop trying. This is what happened to most of modern America. Your great-grandparents cooked from storage because they had to. They knew how to make a stew from dried beans that tasted better than the fresh version. They knew that cured ham, which has been hanging in a smokehouse for months, develops a flavor that fresh pork cannot achieve. They knew that salt-preserved vegetables, when cooked properly, have a depth that fresh vegetables cannot match. They had practiced this cooking their entire lives. It was normal to them. It was how food tasted. Then came the supermarket. Fresh produce arrived every single week, year-round. For the first time in human history, it was possible to cook the same way every day regardless of the season. Dried beans disappeared from the regular diet. Canned vegetables were seen as a step down, not as the normal way to eat. Fresh became the gold standard. And with that shift, the knowledge of how to cook storage foods was lost. It was no longer necessary. Why would you teach your children how to make something from dried beans when they will never need it? That reasoning made sense at the time, but it left us in a dangerous position. In our community, this knowledge never disappears. Children learn to cook from storage the same way they learn to cook from fresh. They cook both. They see their mothers do it. They help. By the time they are 10 or 11 years old, they can walk into a kitchen, look at what is in the cellar, and make a meal that will feed their family. They have practiced it hundreds of times. It is second nature. It is not a crisis skill. It is just cooking. The second lost skill in food preservation and storage is knowing how to stretch what you have. This is different from cooking from storage. This is about making one thing feed more people than it should. This is about rationing without calling it rationing. This is about making a diet that is adequate and nourishing from ingredients that are limited. In the old world, in the Amish communities, and in rural America before the supermarket, this was a necessary art. If you had 10 pounds of stored grain and 12 people to feed and the winter was going to last 6 months, you had to know how to make that grain feed all 12 people adequately. You could not waste any of it. You could not eat too much of it at the beginning and then starve at the end. You had to know, mathematically and practically, how to divide it and how to cook it so that each person got enough calories, enough nutrition, and enough satiety that they could continue working. This was not deprivation. This was not hunger. This was adequacy. This was enough. But it required knowledge. You had to know that a certain amount of beans mixed with a certain amount of grain made a complete protein that could sustain hard work. You had to know that rendering fat from stored meat and using it to cook vegetables made those vegetables more filling and more nutritious. You had to know which combinations of preserved foods created meals that satisfied hunger, not just filled the stomach. The math of this is simple. 1 pound of beans contains roughly 1,500 calories. 1 pound of grain contains roughly 1,600 calories. 1 pound of stored fat contains roughly 4,000 calories. If you are feeding a family of 6 and you have 100 pounds of mixed grains and legumes and 10 pounds of stored fat, that is enough food for roughly 100 days if you are working hard and need 2 to 2,500 calories per person per day. That is 3 months of full nutrition. But only if you know how to combine these things properly. Only if you know the cooking techniques. Only if you have practiced it enough times that you do not have to think about it. Most modern Americans cannot do this calculation. Most would not think to do it. And yet, this is one of the skills that kept entire communities alive through wars, through depressions, through crop failures, and through the simple fact that winter lasts 5 months and the nearest trading post is 50 miles away. This is a survival skill as much as knowing how to start a fire. The third skill is understanding which preservation methods last the longest and which ones are best for which foods. Not all preservation is equal. Some methods preserve food for months. Some preserve for years. Some work only in cold seasons. Some work only in hot seasons. If you do not understand these differences, you can waste enormous amounts of labor and resources. Smoking preserves meat for weeks to months, depending on the climate and how carefully you dry it. Canning preserves vegetables and fruits for 1 to 2 years if done properly. Salt curing preserves meat and fish for months to years, sometimes indefinitely if kept dry. Drying preserves most foods, beans, herbs, fruits, even meat, for 6 months to several years. Root cellars preserve fresh vegetables for months in the right conditions. Fermentation preserves vegetables and creates beneficial bacteria that actually improve nutrition and digestion. Each of these methods requires different knowledge. You cannot smoke vegetables the way you smoke meat. You cannot salt cure grain the way you salt cure fish. You cannot ferment meat the way you ferment cabbage. If you try to use the wrong method, you will produce food that spoils or food that is unsafe to eat. You will waste the resource. And in a time of scarcity, wasting food is not a small mistake. It is a serious problem. In the Amish community where I grew up, you learned these distinctions by necessity. You learned them because your mother did them, your grandmother did them, and you had to know which foods were going into which preservation method so that you could help. You learned which vegetables ferment well: cabbage, cucumbers, beans, beets. You learned which vegetables store well in the root cellar fresh: potatoes, carrots, turnips, squash. You learned which fruits dry well: apples, pears, berries. You learned which meats smoke well: pork, venison, fish. You learned these things not from a book, but from doing them. And crucially, you learned when to do them. You learned that smoking happens in the cold months, when you can control the fire and the meat will not spoil before it is fully cured. You learned that canning happens in late summer and early fall, when the fruit is abundant and fresh. You learned that fermentation happens in the cool season, when the process moves slowly and safely. You learned that root cellar storage works best for vegetables harvested in mid-fall, stored in cool conditions, and used steadily through the winter and spring. You learned that drying happens in warm, dry weather, when the sun is strong and the air is moving. Most of this timing knowledge has been lost because we have electricity now. We can can food anytime we want. We can freeze food anytime we want. We can run dehydrators anytime we want. There is no seasonal rhythm anymore. There is no requirement to understand when preservation must happen. So people do not learn it. And when the power fails, when the electricity is not available, people are suddenly in a season they do not understand. But here is what your great-grandparents understood that you do not yet. Seasonal timing is not a limitation. It is a gift. It is nature telling you when each preservation method works best, because the conditions are right, and when you live by that rhythm, you are not fighting against the seasons. You are working with them. Think about drying. Your ancestors did not dry food in July when it was hot and humid. They did not try to dry it in February when it was cold and damp. They dried it in August and September when the air was warm, the humidity was dropping, and the wind was steady. That was not a choice. That was the only time it worked. And because they understood this, they could gather and prepare their food in those windows. They built their whole year around it. The same with smoking. Smoking meat works best when the outside temperature is between 40 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit and the air is dry. That is fall and early spring, not midsummer. Your grandparents smoked meat in October and again in April. They were not being stubborn. They were being smart. They knew that if you tried to smoke meat in July, the heat would cook it instead of smoke it. The fat would go rancid before the smoke could preserve it. The insects would ruin everything. So they worked in the seasons when smoking actually worked. When you lose electricity, you do not just lose the ability to refrigerate. You lose the assumption that you can preserve food whenever you want. And suddenly, seasonal timing becomes everything. If you are in February and you have no electricity, you cannot can vegetables. The conditions are wrong. You cannot dehydrate them. The air is too damp. But you can use a root cellar. You can store root crops in sand. You can keep things cold in an underground space, because that is exactly when the earth is cold and stable. This is the knowledge that separates people who survive from people who panic. It is not magic. It is not complicated. It is just understanding that every season has the preservation methods that work for it. And if you know what those are, you know what to do. So let me give you what your ancestors actually carried in their heads. This is the real seasonal preservation calendar. In spring, April through May, you preserve by fermenting and by making preserves from early berries. The fermentation works because the temperature is cool but not frozen. The berries are ready. You make it happen then. In early summer, June through July, you focus on drying herbs. The sun is strong. The air is dry and warm. You hang your herbs and they dry in days, not weeks. You do it then because it works then. In midsummer through early fall, August through September, you do your main preservation work. This is canning season. The tomatoes are ready. The cucumbers are ready. The berries are coming in. The heat is strong enough that the canning process works well. You do not need to boil jars for as long. The heat seal happens faster. This is the main season. This is also when you start your smoking season. The temperature is dropping toward that 40 to 60 degree range. The humidity is dropping. You have meat from the fall hunt. You build your smokehouse work into this window. In fall, October through November, You harvest your root crops, and you store them in root cellars. You use sand and earth to keep them cool and slow their ripening. You fill your storage spaces completely in these months because you are using them through winter and into spring. In winter, December through February, you do not do much active preservation. You maintain what you have stored. You eat from your preserved food. You repair your equipment. You rest. Your ancestors understood that this was not a failure. This was necessary. You cannot preserve when conditions do not allow it. So you do not try. And then spring comes again, and you start with fermenting, and the cycle repeats. This is what nobody teaches you anymore. This is what nobody needs to know when they go to the store. But when the electricity fails, this knowledge is the difference between eating well and going hungry, between staying healthy and getting sick, between surviving the year and not. Your great-grandparents lived by this rhythm their entire lives. They were not special people. They were not smarter than you. They simply understood one thing. Preservation happens on nature's schedule, not on yours. And when you understand that, everything else becomes clear. So if you want to start right now, pick one preservation method. If it is spring where you are, start with fermentation. If it is summer, dry herbs. If it is fall, plant a root cellar or start smoking. Do not try to do everything. Just pick one. Learn it well in its proper season. And next year, add another. In 5 years, you will have what your ancestors had. A full larder, seasonal knowledge, and the confidence that comes from knowing you can keep your family fed no matter what happens to the power. Thank you so much for watching this series on forgotten preservation methods. I hope these techniques have shown you that survival is not about panic or complicated equipment. It is about understanding the rhythms your ancestors knew by heart. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to Forgotten Roots Survival so you never miss a new upload. Hit that like button and turn on your notification bell. Your great-grandparents lived by seasons and skill. Let us bring that knowledge back. Together. I will see you in the next one.